Grant thought locking the cellar door finished me. He had no idea the woman he trapped in the dark knew this house better than the blueprints. While he and his mistress prepared to steal my estate for a desperate payout, I only needed a secret passage, my original files, and a few minutes to turn their signing into a crime scene. By the end of the night, this cellar wouldn't hold me. It would bury their greed alive. My name is Brooklyn Rivera. I am 37 years old, the sole owner and lead preservationist of Asheville Conservation Advisory, and right now, I am standing in the exact center of a nightmare designed by the man I married. Just 20 minutes ago, I was upstairs in the grand parlor of my Virginia stone mansion, holding a crystal glass of 50-year-old Cabernet Sauvignon. We were hosting a highly exclusive, private wine tasting. The evening was meticulously curated to welcome a group of so-called strategic investors. My husband, Grant Holloway, wore his tailored Italian suit and his most charming, practiced smile, playing the role of the visionary founder to perfection. But the truth beneath the silk and the smiles was far less glamorous. His boutique hospitality company was bleeding out, gasping for its final breaths, and this lavish dinner was supposed to be his emergency oxygen mask. I had spent 4 agonizing but beautiful years restoring this historical estate, pulling it back from the brink of total structural ruin, turning it into a fortress of architectural elegance. I knew the weight of every timber, the origin of every stone, and the history embedded in the mortar. The air in the parlor was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasted duck, and desperation when Grant leaned into my ear. His hand rested on the small of my back, warm and deceptively familiar. "Brooklyn, darling," he whispered, his tone tight with fabricated urgency. "The humidity monitors for the subterranean cellar are flashing red on my tablet. The temperature just spiked by 3 degrees. Could you go down and check the main panel? You know that climate matrix better than anyone." It was a perfectly reasonable request, engineered to isolate me. I had personally designed the intricate climate control system during the restoration phase to protect the incredibly fragile, historically significant vintage collections. I politely excused myself from a tedious conversation with a venture capitalist and made my way down the main corridor. The stone spiral staircase leading down to the subterranean level was always damp, the air growing noticeably cooler and heavier with every step I took away from the noise of the party. I did not bother to turn on the harsh main floodlights, relying entirely on the soft, amber glow of the recessed step markers. I reached the landing, the rich, earthy aroma of aged oak barrels and wet limestone filling my lungs. I walked purposefully toward the digital diagnostic panel mounted beside the heavy, reinforced steel door of the primary vault. That was when I heard it, the sharp, unmistakable, rhythmic click of stiletto heels striking the stone floor at the top of the stairs. It was not the hesitant, wandering step of a lost guest looking for the powder room. It was a predatory, deliberate march. Sloane Mercer. Grant had introduced her to me 2 months ago as his brilliant restructuring consultant, a woman supposedly hired to trim the financial fat from his failing enterprise. I turned around just as the massive steel door swung violently toward me. The heavy metal slammed into the reinforced frame with a deafening crash, the shockwave vibrating through the soles of my leather shoes. Before I could even raise my hands to brace myself, the heavy exterior deadbolts engaged. 1, 2, 3 loud, definitive metallic thuds echoing in the tight space. I was locked in. I stood in the sudden, suffocating darkness, the only illumination coming from the tiny pulsing green indicator light on the keypad on my side of the door. The physical shock hit me first, a sharp spike of adrenaline, followed immediately by the cold, heavy realization of betrayal. "Grant," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. My words carried easily through the thick brass ventilation grate built into the center of the heavy door. "Grant, open this door right now." "I cannot do that. Brooklyn." His voice drifted down through the metal slats. It was completely devoid of the warmth he had faked upstairs just moments ago. It was cold, calculated, and sharp. "You are going to stay right down there until you sign the transfer documents. I have a pen and a clipboard." I am going to slide the paperwork through the lower security slot. You are going to sign the property over to the new holding entity I created." I stared at the brass grate, the sheer audacity of his demand washing over me. "You are insane if you think I am giving up my home." Another voice joined his, smooth, utterly detached, and dripping with venomous condescension. "You do not have a choice, Brooklyn," Sloane said. "We have already established the narrative upstairs. Everyone saw you looking pale and distressed. Everyone knows you have been under immense pressure with your endless conservation projects. If you do not cooperate, the story is incredibly simple. You had a severe mental breakdown, a total panic attack. You ran down here and locked yourself in the cellar. Who do you think they are going to believe? The brilliant, concerned husband trying to save his erratic wife, or the hysterical woman screaming alone in the basement? This is about the debt," I stated, the final puzzle pieces snapping together in my mind, forming a picture of absolute treachery. "Of course it is about the debt," Grant shouted, his carefully maintained composure slipping for a fraction of a second, his voice cracking under the weight of his own failures. "The luxury wine club project went under. I owe millions. Millions. Brooklyn. The creditors are circling me like vultures. They are going to take everything I have built. This house is the only clean, unencumbered asset left. It is a gold mine. It is the only thing that can save me before they crush me completely. I need the equity, and I need it tonight. Just sign the papers, and I will unlock the door." They waited for the explosion. They waited for me to throw my body against the unforgiving steel, to cry, to beg, to scream until my throat was raw and bleeding. They needed me to break so they could feel justified in their cruelty, to validate the false narrative Sloane had so carefully crafted. They wanted a victim, but I did not give them the satisfaction. I did not panic the way they expected. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the cold cellar air, letting the dampness ground me. I forced my heart rate to steady. I stood perfectly still in the absolute center of the dark room, listening to the harsh, erratic sound of Grant breathing heavily on the other side of the door. I listened to the steady hum of the cooling units. I listened to the metallic reality of the lock. I was not a hysterical wife trapped in a cage. I was an architectural engineer standing inside her own machine, measuring the dimensions of a crime scene. I turned my back away from the heavy steel door and walked deeper into the vault, my hands brushing past the dusty, priceless bottles of vintage Bordeaux. I reached the far back wall, where the original foundation stones met the newer masonry I had commissioned. I ran my fingertips over the rough, damp surface of the rock until I found the slight, almost imperceptible depression hidden directly behind a heavy wooden wine rack. Grant knew every dirty financial loophole in the corporate world, but he knew absolutely nothing about the actual bones of this house. During the second year of the restoration process, while clearing out decades of debris, I had unearthed a collapsed, forgotten service tunnel dating back to the Prohibition era. I never put it on the official blueprints. I personally rebuilt it, reinforced it with steel, and kept it exclusively as a secret for myself. I pressed my palm firmly against the hidden mechanical latch. The heavy stone panel shifted backward with a soft, grinding whisper, revealing a narrow, pitch-black void. I stepped through the opening, my shoulder brushing against the rough, century-old masonry. As soon as my weight cleared the threshold, I engaged the internal locking mechanism. The panel slid shut, sealing seamlessly against the cellar wall. The sudden silence was absolute, a profound contrast to the chaotic betrayal I had just escaped. I reached out, my fingers tracing the familiar contours of the secondary breaker box mounted to my right. I flipped the main switch. Instantly, a row of low-voltage LED strips flickered to life, illuminating a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled, fireproof vault. I never intended for this to be a panic room. When I designed this space 4 years ago, I envisioned a sanctuary, a heritage archive dedicated entirely to preserving the soul of Ashevale. The walls were lined with reinforced steel shelving holding the true history of the estate. There were waterproof safes containing the original parchment deeds dating back over 100 years. Detailed topographic maps outlining the strict conservation easements, thousands of pages of architectural restoration logs, and multiple redundant server towers constantly backing up the estate's entire digital footprint. On the central desk sat a high-resolution document scanner, a dedicated emergency landline completely severed from the main house network, and a discreet, reinforced spiral staircase tucked into the far corner that fed directly up into a false bookcase in my private library on the ground floor. I was not trapped. I was simply moving to a better vantage point, shifting from the role of the hunted to the invisible observer. I walked over to the bank of monitors arrayed across the oak desk and tapped the spacebar on the primary keyboard. The screens flared to life, feeding me high-definition, uncompressed video from the discrete microcameras I had installed throughout the property during the renovation. I pulled up the feed for the private tasting room situated directly above my current location. The audio kicked in a second later, crisp and perfectly clear, bringing the deceit right into my sanctuary. Grant and Sloane were no longer alone. Sitting across from them at the massive oak tasting table were two men I immediately recognized. The first was Travis Boone, a notoriously slippery closing agent and notary public whose name frequently circulated in the darker, less regulated corners of the commercial real estate circuit. He was nervously adjusting his cheap silk tie, pulling a heavy brass notary stamp from his battered leather briefcase. Beside him lounged Cormac Vale. Cormac was a ruthless luxury developer known for aggressively acquiring distressed properties, stripping them of their historical designations, and bulldozing their integrity to build hyper-modern, soulless mega-mansions for the ultra-rich. Seeing Cormac sitting at my table, swirling a glass of my reserve wine, made my blood run cold. Grant was not simply trying to take out a desperate second mortgage to save his failing hospitality brand. He was executing a total, irrevocable transfer of ownership. He was selling my legacy, the very walls that surrounded us, to a man who would tear them down without a second thought. This was a fully orchestrated, fraudulent closing happening entirely in the shadows of a single night. Sloane leaned forward, her posture rigid and businesslike, sliding a thick stack of legal-sized paper across the polished oak surface toward Travis. I zoomed in on the central monitor, the high-resolution lens capturing the bold, black headings on the first few pages. My eyes scanned the text, analyzing the legal architecture of their treason. It was a masterpiece of manufactured deceit. The top document was an emergency, durable power of attorney. Beneath it lay a sworn declaration of temporary medical incapacitation, detailing a completely fabricated narrative of my supposed mental breakdown, claiming the stress of the restoration had driven me to severe instability. Then came the final closing disclosures, and a forged set of corporate minutes claiming I had voluntarily stepped down as the managing member of the holding company, granting Grant unilateral authority to liquidate the asset. Travis picked up the stack, flipping through the pages with practiced speed, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. He paused at the signature lines. "The ink looks fresh," Travis muttered, his voice carrying a slight tremor of anxiety that the sensitive microphones picked up perfectly. "Are you absolutely certain these hold up under scrutiny? A medical incapacitation claim is a massive liability if the spouse suddenly shows up coherent." Sloane offered a razor-thin, patronizing smile. "I personally secured those signatures," she lied, her voice dripping with artificial confidence. "She is currently locked away, deeply medicated, and completely unresponsive to reality. The narrative is airtight. Just stamp the paper, Travis." I stared at the screen, my eyes locking onto the looping script at the bottom of the power of attorney. My stomach twisted into a violent knot, bile rising in my throat. It was my signature, or rather, an immaculate replica of it. But I did not sign those papers. I studied the distinct pressure marks, the specific slant of the ink, and the slight hesitation in the loop of the letter R. Then, The realization hit me like a physical blow, sharper than the sound of the cellar door locking. It was identical to the wet signatures I had provided 3 weeks ago on a massive stack of grant approvals for my late mother's memorial charity fund. Grant had volunteered to courier those highly sensitive documents to the foundation board for me, playing the supportive husband. Instead, he and Sloan had systematically traced, copied, and applied my charitable approvals to their fraudulent property transfer. They had weaponized my mother's memory, stealing the pen strokes meant for philanthropy to steal my home. A raw, primal urge surged through me. My first instinct was to sprint up the spiral staircase, burst through the library doors, and tear the documents from the table. I wanted to scream, to expose them right then and there, to watch the color drain from Grant's arrogant face as I shattered his carefully constructed illusion. But I forced my hands, which were curled into tight fists, to relax. I forced my breathing to slow, matching the steady, mechanical hum of the server racks behind me. I am a preservationist. I spend my life painstakingly uncovering the truth hidden beneath layers of decay, carefully documenting every single detail before making a move. If I stormed upstairs right now, I would merely interrupt a meeting. They could easily snatch the papers back, claim it was a misunderstanding, or spin some elaborate lie about drafting contingencies for my failing health. They would be liars, but they would still be free. They could simply regroup and try again from a different angle. I stared at the monitor, watching Travis uncap his heavy fountain pen, hovering it over the notary block. I needed them to commit. I needed the ink to dry on the page. I needed Travis to press his official brass stamp into the paper, officially transforming their desperate, pathetic lies into severe, federally prosecutable felonies. If I stepped out now, I was a victim escaping a trap. If I waited, I became the architect of their absolute destruction. The house was a fortress, and they had just locked themselves inside with the warden. I sat down in the heavy leather chair in front of the monitors, reaching out to pick up my secure emergency phone. The rules of the game had completely changed. I was going to let them finish their performance. I was going to let them believe they had won, that they had successfully outsmarted me and stolen my life's work. Because when the curtain finally fell tonight, I would ensure they handed me every piece of evidence I needed to bury them. The ambient hum of the server racks behind me faded into white noise as I leaned closer to the primary monitor. I dialed up the audio gain on the hidden microphone embedded in the vintage chandelier directly above the tasting table. Every scrape of a chair, every clink of crystal, every breath was amplified. The panic that had briefly gripped Grant downstairs was gone, replaced by a toxic, festering resentment that he was now freely pouring out to his co-conspirators. "You have no idea what it has been like," Grant was saying, leaning back in his chair and loosening his silk tie. He swirled the wine in his glass, staring at the deep red liquid with absolute disdain. "I have endured this marriage for nearly 5 years. Do you know what it does to a man to live in a sprawling estate? To host the wealthiest players in the state? And know that legally, you are nothing but a glorified guest. Every time I wanted to leverage this property to expand my brand, I had to ask her permission. She treats this house like a sacred temple, and she treats me like a tenant. I am done living under her shadow. I could not possibly care less about your marital grievances, Grant," Cormac interrupted, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded the room. The developer leaned forward, tapping a thick, heavy finger against the topographical map spread across the oak table. "And I certainly do not care about the historical value of these stones. I am not buying a museum. My clients do not want to sleep in a preserved relic. I want the 40 acres of elevated hillside directly behind the main structure. As soon as the title clears, I am bulldozing the old vines. We are grading the slope and putting up a 12-unit, ultra-exclusive resort compound, floor-to-ceiling glass, private infinity pools, and a helipad. The mansion itself will just be a temporary clubhouse until we inevitably find structural flaws and tear it down for a modern amenities center." My hands gripped the edge of the desk. To hear them talk so casually about erasing my life's work, about destroying the very earth I had fought so hard to protect, was sickening. But the cruelty was only just beginning. Travis nervously tapped his pen against his leather briefcase. Then we need to finish this right now. We cannot drag this out. By 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, the county registry system automatically updates its digital records. That new land conservation clause she submitted last month goes live on the public server. Once that zoning lock is digitally registered, the hillside becomes officially untouchable for commercial development. If we do not have a stamped, backdated transfer of title filed before the system refreshes, this entire deal is dead. And we all go down for attempted fraud. Relax, Travis, Sloane purred, her voice dripping with toxic confidence. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a separate, thick manila folder. Everything is perfectly insulated. I spent the last 3 weeks building an airtight psychological profile on our dear Brooklyn. She tossed the folder onto the table, the sound of paper slapping against the wood echoing through the speakers. I fabricated a series of telehealth psychiatric evaluations. I spliced audio clips from her actual business calls to create out-of-context voicemails sounding frantic and unhinged. I even had a colleague of mine, a licensed physician who owes me a significant favor, sign off on the clinical notes without ever being in the same room as her. According to this file, Brooklyn has been suffering from severe paranoid delusions, extreme insomnia, and crippling anxiety brought on by the financial stress of her business. When they find her locked in that cellar tomorrow, screaming and dehydrated, it will simply confirm the diagnosis. The courts will easily accept the temporary power of attorney without a second thought. A cold shiver ran down my spine. They had not just planned a financial theft. They had orchestrated the complete assassination of my character and my sanity. They intended to strip me of my credibility so thoroughly that even if I told the truth, no one would ever believe me. I shifted my focus to the secondary monitor, which was linked to a micro camera positioned on the bookshelf directly behind Grant. The angle gave me a perfect, unobstructed view of his open laptop screen. He had his email client minimized, and a master financial spreadsheet was pulled up. I typed a quick command on my keyboard, utilizing the high-definition zoom to read the individual cells. My breath caught in my throat. The spreadsheet was not a projection of the resort deal. It was a ledger of my own company, Ashevale Conservation Advisory. I watched as the cursor highlighted a column labeled as imported material costs. There were dozens of line items spread over the past 6 months. $85,000 for reclaimed French oak, $120,000 for period-accurate Italian marble, $45,000 for custom brass fittings. But as I traced the routing numbers adjacent to those massive expenses, the final destination was not my trusted European suppliers. Every single wire transfer was funneled directly into a domestic shell corporation registered under Grant's name. He had been systematically bleeding my conservation business dry, embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars right under my nose to artificially inflate his failing hospitality brand. Then, the final, devastating blow landed. On the screen, Grant clicked to the next tab in the workbook. The header at the top of the page read, Olivia Rivera Memorial Fund. Speaking of liquidity, Cormac said, his tone shifting to something predatory and sharp. My preliminary site team needs a massive cash injection to fast-track the demolition permits before the local historical society catches wind of our plans. Does the charity account still have enough capital to smooth out our cash flow report for the next 30 days? Grant did not even hesitate. Absolutely. I transferred another $200,000 out of the memorial fund just yesterday. I coded it as an anonymous grant for an overseas restoration project. The board will not notice the discrepancy until the annual audit next year. And by then, this resort will be generating enough revenue to quietly replace the funds. It is perfectly handled. I sat frozen in the chair. The air in the vault suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been violently sucked from the room. The Olivia Rivera Memorial Fund was the most sacred thing in my life. I established that foundation the year my mother died. It was designed to provide grants to young, underprivileged architects and to preserve the historic community centers in the neighborhoods where she grew up. It was her legacy. It was my tribute to the woman who taught me how to rebuild broken things. And Grant had turned it into a slush fund for his corrupt, destructive schemes. This was no longer a story about a failing marriage. This was not merely an aggressive business dispute or an ugly divorce. As I sat in the darkness, watching the man I had loved laugh with a group of predators over the corpse of my life, a profound and terrifying clarity washed over me. Grant and Sloane had not just plotted to steal a stone mansion. They had launched a coordinated, parasitic invasion of my entire existence. They wanted my home, my professional reputation, the company I built from nothing, and the very memory of my mother. They wanted to consume my entire ecosystem and leave me institutionalized, bankrupt, and broken. The shock and the heartbreak that had initially paralyzed me in the cellar completely evaporated. It burned away entirely, leaving behind something entirely different, something cold, precise, and utterly ruthless. They thought they had trapped a fragile artist in the dark. They thought I would crumble under the weight of their betrayal. They were wrong. I reached for the secure emergency phone on the desk, my fingers perfectly steady. The time for observation was over. It was time to start breaking their world apart piece by piece. I picked up the heavy black receiver of the hardwired emergency landline. It operated on a closed-circuit fiber optic cable, entirely bypassed from the main router that Grant controlled upstairs. I dialed the private, unlisted cellular number of Mara Quill. Mara was not just a lawyer. She was a predatory apex litigator who specialized in high-stakes property disputes, corporate warfare, and untangling complex financial fraud. We had worked together for over 10 years, and she was the architect of my most secure legal frameworks. "Brooklyn." Mara answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and instantly alert despite the late hour. "It is nearly 10 o'clock at night. Tell me the world is ending." "Grant is currently sitting in my tasting room attempting to sell the estate to Cormac Vale," I said, my voice as flat and even as a pane of tempered glass. "He has Sloane Mercer and a bottom-feeder notary named Travis Boone with him. They have forged my signature on an emergency power of attorney and a medical incapacitation declaration. They plan to close the deal tonight." There was exactly 1 second of absolute silence on the line before Mara shifted into a gear I knew very well. "Are you in a safe location right now?" "I am inside the Heritage Vault," I replied, my fingers already flying across the illuminated mechanical keyboard on the desk. "Grant thinks he locked me inside the main wine cellar. I am sending you a secure, encrypted link right now. The password is your mother's maiden name, all lowercase letters. It will give you a live, high-definition audio and video feed of the tasting room. I am also pushing over high-resolution scans of the forged documents Sloane brought. You will see my supposed signature on the last page. I want you to compare it to the foundation grant approvals I signed 3 weeks ago. It is a direct trace." I heard the rapid clicking of Mara's mouse on the other end of the line. Then, I heard a sharp intake of breath. "I see them on the monitor, and I see the paperwork. This is incredibly sloppy, Brooklyn, but it is also highly dangerous. They are trying to execute a quitclaim deed alongside a fraudulent corporate resolution to bypass your authority. They think because we currently live here, it defaults to community property," I stated, pulling up the master operating agreement on my third monitor to verify the clauses. "But we both know the reality. I placed this entire estate, including the 40 acres of hillside, into a multi-tiered, prenuptial trust completely shielded from marital assets long before I even walked down the aisle. Grant is not an officer, a shareholder, or a beneficiary. He does not have the legal standing to sell a single blade of grass on this property. I know the structure. Brooklyn, I drafted the ironclad clauses myself," Mara said, her tone turning grim and urgent. "But here is the immediate problem we are facing. If Travis brings that brass notary stamp down onto that forged signature and files the electronic transfer into the county registry system, we are going to be dragged into a horrific, expensive, and prolonged legal maze. Once that fraudulent deed is officially recorded, Cormac will immediately leverage his political connections to force an eviction and bring in his demolition crews. We will win eventually, but it could take 2 to 3 years of brutal litigation to clear the title, and the historical integrity of the property could be compromised or destroyed in the crossfire. We cannot let that ink dry on the official record. We must delay them for as long as possible. I need you to file an emergency ex parte injunction to freeze all potential title transfers on this specific parcel, I instructed, my eyes tracking every single movement Grant made on the high-definition screen. And I want you to call the County Real Estate Fraud Investigation Unit. Get a senior investigator on the line immediately. Then, call the local sheriff. Tell them a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud and an illegal confinement operation are currently in progress at my address. Consider it done. I am firing up my paralegal team right now. Mara confirmed, the sound of a heavy oak door closing in her background echoing through the receiver. I will be leaving my office in exactly 5 minutes. I am coming with the authorities. Just stall them. Brooklyn, do not let them finalize the paperwork. The line clicked dead. I did not waste a single millisecond. I opened the main server interface on my terminal. With a series of precise keystrokes, I initiated a total forensic backup of the entire estate's digital footprint. I exported the digital door lock logs, generating an immutable record proving exactly when Grant engaged the deadbolts and trapped me inside the cellar. I compiled the time-stamped video and audio files of their entire conspiracy, capturing every confession of their premeditated fraud. I bundled the restrictive conservation easements, the original deeds, and the damning financial ledgers showing Grant embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from my company and my mother's memorial fund. I routed the entire massive encrypted packet, containing over 400 gigabytes of incontrovertible proof, to an untouchable, off-site cloud server located in a secure underground facility on the other side of the country. If they somehow managed to breach this vault tonight, they would find absolutely nothing they could destroy. Now, it was time to change the environment. I closed the server logs and opened the master environmental control matrix. This house was a finely tuned instrument, and I held the conductor's baton. I located the specific digital zone for the upper tasting room. I bypassed the manual wall thermostats that Grant was relying on and completely disabled the primary cooling compressors for that sector. Then, I closed the ventilation dampers, trapping the heavy, humid air inside the room. With 4 people inside, the hot overhead lighting, and the massive stone fireplace they had lit for aesthetic purposes, the temperature would begin to climb steadily toward 85 degrees Fahrenheit within minutes. Next, I accessed the perimeter security protocols. I clicked on the heavy wrought iron main entry gates located half a mile down the private driveway. I overrode the standard proximity sensors and engaged the total lockdown mode. The thick steel locking pins slammed into place with a definitive mechanical action. No vehicles could enter without my explicit digital authorization. And far more importantly, no one could drive out. They were physically confined to the grounds of the estate. Finally, I switched the entire internal security system from a standard 30-day rolling overwrite to a permanent evidentiary archive mode. Every word spoken, every bead of sweat that dropped, and every lie they told would be preserved forever in high definition for the impending criminal trial. A lesser person might have picked up the intercom microphone right then. They might have screamed threats, pounded their fists on the ceiling, or demanded to be released. I did none of those things. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, crossing my arms tightly over my chest. I watched the 4 of them on the monitors, completely oblivious to the invisible net tightening around their throats. I wanted them to feel secure. I wanted them to feel incredibly powerful. Because when a person operates from a place of absolute, unchecked greed, they invariably reveal their truest, ugliest self. Fear makes people cautious, but greed makes them reckless and talkative. I wanted Grant to speak freely about his hatred. I wanted Sloane to flaunt her arrogant manipulation. I wanted Cormac to bare his predatory fangs. Every single second they spent believing they were winning the game was another nail hammered firmly into their own coffins. The small blue notification light on my secure phone flashed brilliantly in the dim room. It was a single encrypted text message from Mara. The injunction has been submitted to a federal judge. The fraud unit and 2 armed sheriff deputies are in my vehicle. We are 20 minutes away. I looked up at the central monitor. Grant was laughing loudly at something Sloane had just said, his perfectly straight teeth flashing in the warm, golden light of the vintage chandelier. He looked so incredibly handsome, so perfectly successful in his tailored suit. He was a hollow, empty shell of a man entirely propped up by the financial resources and the sheer willpower of the woman he was actively trying to destroy. I reached out and gently rested my fingertips against the cold glass surface of the screen, right over Grant's smiling face. The easiest part of this entire horrific ordeal would be unlocking the secret spiral staircase door and walking out into my library. The real challenge, the true art of this execution, was calculating the exact, perfect moment to step out of the shadows. I would not interrupt their performance prematurely. I would wait patiently until the curtain was fully raised. The audience of investors was seated, and the final, devastating act of their pathetic play was in motion. When I finally revealed myself, it would not be as a broken victim seeking a desperate rescue. It would be as the absolute, undisputed master of the house, delivering the final, inescapable verdict. Upstairs, the heavy oak tasting room was completely sealed. I sat in the cool, climate-controlled comfort of my hidden vault, watching the thermal sensors on my primary monitor slowly tick upwards. 72 degrees, 76 degrees, 80 degrees. The massive stone fireplace they had lit earlier to impress Cormac Vale was now acting as a literal furnace, pumping dry, suffocating heat into the airtight space. Without the sophisticated ventilation system cycling the air, the oxygen in the room was rapidly becoming stagnant and heavy. Grant was the first to physically show the severe strain of the rising temperature. He subtly hooked an index finger under the tight knot of his expensive silk tie, pulling it down just a fraction of an inch to let his damp neck breathe. He was desperately trying to maintain the polished, confident veneer of a successful hospitality magnate pitching a flawless, turnkey asset, but the physical environment was aggressively turning against him. His forehead glistened under the bright chandelier, and the contrast between his smooth pitch and his sweating reality was becoming painfully obvious. Travis Boone wiped a heavy bead of sweat from his pale forehead using the back of his hand. He looked down at the thick stack of forged legal documents, visibly agitated by the oppressive conditions. "Grant, you need to fix the ventilation in here right now," Travis snapped, his voice tight, nasal, and completely unprofessional. "The ambient humidity is going to ruin the custom paper stock. If my sweat smears this official notary ink, the county clerk will reject the entire filing tomorrow morning. I did not agree to work in a sauna. I am taking on a massive amount of personal liability here just being in this room. I want an additional $10,000 wired to my offshore account for hazardous working conditions before I stamp a single page." Grant shot the notary a venomous, panicked glare but tried to quickly smooth his features into a reassuring, practiced smile as he turned back to the developer. "I apologize. Gentlemen, it seems we are experiencing a minor glitch with the smart home interface. Brooklyn usually manages all the residential technology." Cormac Vale did not return the smile. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, his sharp, predatory eyes scrutinizing the sweltering room before fixing a cold, unforgiving stare directly onto my husband. "A minor glitch?" Cormac asked, his deep voice echoing menacingly in the stifling room. "You are asking me to sink tens of millions of dollars into a property transfer tonight, yet you cannot even keep the air conditioning running in your own primary residence. Why is a $20 million historical estate operating like a brick oven on the exact night you are trying to convince me it is perfectly managed? It makes me wonder what other catastrophic structural failures you are hiding behind the expensive drywall." "Grant, The crack in Grant's arrogant armor was fully visible now. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his damp collar. I did not give him a single second to recover his composure. It was time to strip away the illusion of his wealth. I turned my attention to the cellar management interface on my left monitor. The tasting room upstairs was equipped with two massive, custom-built smart screens disguised as framed vintage mirrors. They were originally designed to display the tasting notes, vineyard history, and provenance of the rare wines we serve to our high-end clients. I bypassed the standard display loop entirely and activated the aggressive inventory audit mode. Instantly, the two massive screens in the tasting room flashed a brilliant, blinding crimson. A loud, sharp electronic chime pierced the heated, heavy air, demanding everyone's immediate attention. The screens began displaying a scrolling, high-visibility list of the exact vintage bottles Grant had pulled from the racks for the evening. Beside each bottle's specific name, a bold, flashing yellow text banner appeared. Reading consignment only. Property of the Asheville Historical Society. Not for private consumption or sale. Grant froze completely. The remaining color rapidly drained from his flushed, sweating face. He had been posturing to Cormac all evening, pouring glasses of incredibly rare, aged Bordeaux, and pretending they were prized possessions from his personal, extensive private collection. I had just publicly and digitally branded him a cheap thief who was drinking someone else's strictly regulated inventory. Sloane Mercer forced a harsh, entirely artificial laugh. She quickly stood up, her expensive heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she walked toward the screens as if she could physically wipe the damning text away with her bare hands. "Please ignore that, Cormac," she said, her voice strained and tight. The effortless, seductive charm she possessed earlier completely melting away in the 85-degree heat. "It is just a ridiculous software error. The inventory system is clearly syncing with the wrong external museum database. I will have our private IT department reset the entire server cluster first thing tomorrow morning." Cormac did not say a single word in response. He just stared at the blaring red screens, then slowly looked back at Sloane, his expression completely unreadable and dark. But I could see the exact moment the absolute trust fractured in his eyes. A ruthless, billionaire developer does not survive in his industry by ignoring glaring red flags, and right now, my house was waving them violently in his face. It was time to shatter their alliance completely. I opened my encrypted internal security archives. A month ago, I had noticed Sloane lingering alone in my library after a supposed consulting meeting with my husband. Suspicious. I had reviewed the hidden camera footage later that evening and caught her taking a private, hushed phone call. I isolated that specific audio file, routed it directly into the tasting room's high-fidelity surround sound ceiling speakers, and maximized the output volume. I pressed play. The loud, crisp sound of Sloane's voice suddenly blasted from the ceiling above them, completely drowning out the nervous, suffocating silence in the room. "Do not worry about Grant." The recorded voice of Sloane echoed from every corner of the room, speaking to an unknown man on the other end of her phone call. "Grant is just a temporary bridge. He is desperate, drowning in debt, and incredibly gullible. As soon as we close the house and transfer the title, I am taking my percentage of the equity and walking away entirely. He will be left holding the entire bag of corporate debt. He is going to take the fall for all of it." The audio clip ended abruptly, leaving a deafening, heavy silence in its wake. Down in the vault, I watched the absolute psychological devastation unfold in high definition. Grant stood completely paralyzed next to the oak table, staring at the woman he was preparing to destroy my life for. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might actually shatter. The profound betrayal etched onto his face was raw, ugly, and absolute. He had genuinely believed he was the brilliant master manipulator orchestrating a grand financial theft, only to discover in front of his investors that he was nothing but a disposable, pathetic pawn in his mistress's longer game. Sloane's face turned a sickening shade of ash gray. "Someone is hacking the local network," she shrieked. Her carefully constructed, sophisticated persona violently tearing apart at the seams. She pointed wildly at the ceiling speakers, her hands trembling. "Grant, you have to believe me. I swear to you. That audio is digitally altered. It is a fabricated deepfake." Brooklyn must have set a digital trap in the system before she had her breakdown and locked herself in the cellar. Travis Boone did not wait for the argument to escalate into violence. The nervous notary slammed his heavy leather ledger shut with a loud, definitive crack. His hands were shaking violently as he shoved his brass stamp, his pens, and the forged medical documents back into his battered briefcase. He snapped the metallic lock shut. "I am absolutely done." Travis stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy mahogany double doors leading to the hallway. This entire room is a federal criminal indictment waiting to happen. The property title is clearly contested. The managing partners are actively turning on each other, and the house itself is practically screaming at us to leave. I am leaving this estate right now. In a matter of minutes, the luxurious tasting room had transformed from a stage of sophisticated corporate theft into a sweltering, claustrophobic interrogation cell. Every single lie they had meticulously crafted was being systematically dismantled by the very architecture they thought they were stealing. They were turning on each other like starving animals, entirely unaware that the heavy iron gates at the bottom of the long driveway were completely locked shut. The hidden security cameras were recording every single panicked confession for the authorities. And the woman they thought they had buried in the dark was watching their entire world burn to the ground. The heavy mahogany doors were Travis Boone's only goal, but before the panicked notary could reach the brass handles, Grant lunged across the stifling room. He did not go for Travis. He grabbed Sloane Mercer by the upper arm, his fingers sinking fiercely into the fine fabric of her designer dress, and dragged her roughly into the shadowy corner near the towering stone fireplace. "Explain that recording right now," Grant hissed, his voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of rage and profound humiliation. The heat in the room was suffocating, the temperature steadily climbing, but the icy venom in his eyes was absolute. Sloane did not cower. She violently yanked her arm free, letting out a sharp, cold laugh that cut right through the heavy air. The sophisticated, supportive mistress facade evaporated entirely, revealing the ruthless mercenary beneath. "Explain what? Grant that you are an incompetent husband who actually believed he was the smartest person in the room. You honestly thought I was going to tie my professional future to a sinking ship. You are drowning in catastrophic debt. I was simply ensuring I had a secure lifeboat before you dragged us all to the bottom of the ocean." Grant's face flushed a violent, ugly shade of crimson. "I built a hospitality empire. I just needed a temporary bridge loan to stabilize the cash flow," he shouted, completely losing his grip on reality and the volume of his own voice. "Do you have any idea what I have sacrificed to keep my company afloat? I have been siphoning cash out of Ashevale Conservation Advisory for almost an entire year just to cover my own payroll. I bled her business accounts dry, and this house was supposed to replace the missing funds before the annual audit caught me." The words hung in the sweltering, stagnant air, down in the vault. I did not even blink. But upstairs, the reaction was instantaneous. Cormac Vale, who had been watching the lovers quarrel with detached disgust, suddenly stood up from the oak tasting table. The massive developer's demeanor shifted from irritated impatience to absolute defensive hostility. A fraudulent, rushed closing was a calculated business risk in his world, but confessed. Systematic corporate embezzlement. That was a direct, unavoidable ticket to a federal penitentiary. "You stole from her corporate accounts," Cormac stated, his deep voice dangerously flat. He looked at Grant not as a business partner, but as an infected liability. "That means the equity in this estate is explicitly tied to embezzled funds. The entire property title is inherently contaminated. If I wire a single dollar into your holding company tonight, the federal government will seize my assets as an accessory to corporate fraud. You're like a walking contagion." "Grant." Sloane recognized her chance to distance herself entirely from the fallout and took it without the slightest hesitation. She turned toward Cormac and Travis, her tone shifting into a desperate, pleading defense. "I had absolutely nothing to do with the stolen company funds," she declared rapidly, throwing her hands up. "He is entirely unhinged. He orchestrated this entire hostile takeover. Grant forced me to draft those temporary incapacitation documents over 8 weeks ago. This was not a sudden emergency to save his business tonight. He spent 2 solid months planning exactly how to drug his wife, lock her away, and steal her ancestral property." Travis Boone let out a high, panicked noise that sounded almost like a sob. 8 weeks! Premeditated kidnapping and federal wire fraud. I am absolutely done. I am leaving this property immediately. He scrambled toward the exit again, his battered leather briefcase clutched tightly against his chest like a shield. But Grant moved faster. He stepped squarely in front of the heavy mahogany double doors, blocking the only primary exit. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wild and completely cornered. "Nobody is leaving this room," Grant roared, slamming his open palms against the wood. "You already applied your official notary seal to half of those declarations. Travis, if you walk out that door right now, I swear I will hand your name to the district attorney the absolute second the authorities arrive. We are all deeply involved in this, and we are all going to finish it." Down in the subterranean vault, I calmly typed a new sequence of commands into the master security console. If they somehow managed to push past Grant in their panic, I needed to ensure they could not scatter into the night. I accessed the mechanical controls for the rear service elevator that connected the massive commercial kitchen to the underground delivery bay. I disabled the power relay entirely, locking the steel carriage firmly between the floors. Next, I targeted the multi-bay luxury garage attached to the eastern wing of the estate. I engaged the heavy steel hurricane shutters, sealing their expensive imported vehicles behind an impenetrable wall of reinforced metal. There would be no quiet escapes through the service corridors. If any of them wanted to leave my property, they would have to march straight out the grand front entrance, directly into the glaring lights of the approaching sheriff cruisers. On my central monitor, I watched Cormac Vale pull a sleek encrypted satellite phone from his tailored jacket pocket. He completely ignored Grant's frantic shouting and walked to the far corner of the sweltering room, pressing the device tightly to his ear. I dialed the audio gain up to maximum, isolating his specific frequency over the sound of the arguing. "Wake up the senior partners right now," Cormac ordered his private attorney, his voice a low, furious rumble. "I need you to pull the preliminary county title report on the Rivera estate again. Look at the municipal zoning addendums. Is there a strict historical preservation easement attached to the hillside acreage?" There was a brief, agonizing pause as he listened to his lawyer frantically type on the other end of the line. Then, Cormac closed his eyes, his massive shoulders slumping slightly as the devastating truth hit him. "It is permanently zoned for conservation," Cormac muttered to himself, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated rage. He slowly lowered the phone. "We cannot grade the slope. We cannot secure a single demolition permit. The land is completely useless to us." He ended the call and slowly turned back to face the center of the room. The absolute absurdity of the situation washed over his face. He had risked his entire billion-dollar development empire, conspired to commit a massive real estate fraud, and sat in an 85-degree room for an asset that held absolutely zero commercial value to his firm. The property was legally bulletproof long before they even sat down at the tasting table. The dynamic in the tasting room had completely fractured. The sophisticated aura of high-stakes corporate maneuvering was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, ugly reality of cornered predators. They were no longer a unified front conspiring to steal my home and my legacy. They were a pack of desperate scavengers, viciously tearing at each other's throats, frantically trying to find a way to survive the fallout of their own catastrophic greed. And I just sat in the cool, silent darkness of my vault, watching the magnificent structure of their deceit collapse inward, crushing them all. The delusion of a cornered man is a fascinating, repulsive thing to witness. Despite the fact that his private development deal with Cormac Vale had just violently imploded, Grant refused to accept the reality of his collapsing empire. He stepped away from the heavy mahogany doors, his chest heaving beneath his ruined, sweat-soaked silk shirt. He aggressively checked his gold wristwatch, his movements erratic and sharp. "Listen to me," Grant commanded, his voice raw with a desperate, manic authority that echoed off the heated stone walls. In exactly 12 minutes, a syndicate of boutique private equity lenders and silent investors is going to arrive at this estate. They are coming for a private viewing of the property, a tasting of the reserve collection, and to sign the principal agreement for a massive bridge loan using the primary residence as collateral. "We are going to get through this evening. We will deal with everything else tomorrow." Cormac let out a low, dark chuckle from the shadowy corner of the room. The billionaire developer casually sank back into a plush leather armchair, swirling the warm, expensive wine in his glass. He had clearly decided to stay, no longer as a business partner, but as a cruel spectator waiting out of pure morbid curiosity for the inevitable. Spectacular crash of Grant's fragile ego. Grant completely ignored him. He turned his manic, terrifying energy onto his mistress. "Sloane, go to the powder room, fix your makeup. Stop looking like a terrified accomplice and put the sophisticated intellectual consultant mask back on right now." Sloane glared at him with absolute, venomous hatred, but the sheer gravity of their shared criminality forced her to comply. She practically snatched her silver compact mirror from her designer tote bag, her trembling fingers frantically dabbing heavy powder over her flushed, damp skin. "Travis," Grant snapped, pointing a trembling finger at the panicked notary, "take those forged papers back out of your briefcase, smooth the edges, lay them out perfectly on the oak table. When those lenders walk into this room, they need to see a professional, fully prepared closing environment, not a sweltering sweat box filled with terrified cowards." Travis looked incredibly pale, as if he might be sick right there on the polished hardwood floor. But Grant's physical intimidation kept him frozen in place. He slowly unlatched his heavy leather bag, pulling the stack of fabricated medical declarations and the fraudulent power of attorney back into the suffocating, stifling air of the room. He used the sleeve of his cheap suit to wipe the condensation from the table before laying the pristine, fake documents down. Down in the crisp, climate-controlled silence of my vault, I watched the pathetic, grotesque theater unfold on my high-definition monitors. Grant was furiously kicking the sharp shards of a shattered crystal wine glass under the heavy Persian rug, desperately trying to hide the physical evidence of their earlier, violent confrontation. They were wiping the heavy sweat from their brows, straightening their expensive collars, and aggressively swallowing their mutual hatred. They looked exactly like a cast of terrible actors frantically reapplying their stage makeup while the theater around them literally burned to the ground. The glowing screen of my secure, hardwired emergency phone illuminated with a silent, incoming text message from Mara Quill. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the encrypted text. "The emergency judicial injunction is officially logging into the federal docket right now. The county sheriff and the senior title fraud investigator are turning off the main highway and entering your private access road. We need exactly 8 more minutes. Keep them inside that room. 8 minutes." The final countdown had officially begun, while Grant desperately tried to construct a fragile illusion of control upstairs. I turned my attention away from the glowing digital screens and focused on the heavy, fireproof safe situated on the desk beside me. I spun the combination dial with practiced precision, pulling the thick steel door open. Inside lay the true, undeniable reality of Ashevale. I reached in and pulled out the thick, leather-bound portfolio containing the original, authentic property documents. I carefully laid the heavy parchment papers out across the polished oak desk under the bright surgical glow of the LED lamp. I traced my fingers over the unbroken chain of title, a document that proved my sole, uncontested ownership of the estate. I flipped past the strict municipal land conservation easement that had just effectively destroyed Cormac's ruthless development dreams. Next, I reviewed the freshly printed bank statements I had pulled from my corporate servers, highlighting the exact routing numbers where Grant had systematically drained my restoration company to illegally fund his failing, desperate lifestyle. But the most devastating weapon in my entire arsenal was buried at the very bottom of the heavy portfolio. It was a massive, fatal legal twist that Grant could not possibly comprehend because his sheer arrogance had completely blinded him to my intelligence. Exactly 14 days ago, I had noticed the subtle, lingering scent of Sloane's expensive perfume baked into Grant's jacket collar. I noticed the unexplainable. Sudden cash shortages in my company ledger. I smelled the distinct, rotting stench of absolute betrayal. Instead of confronting him and engaging in a useless, screaming argument that would only give him time to hide his assets, I quietly drove to Mara's downtown law office. Together, we drafted and executed an irrevocable addendum to the ironclad prenuptial trust that held the entire estate. I legally reclassified the property, placing it under a highly restrictive protective covenant. The new legally binding terms dictated that the immediate successor beneficiary of the estate was the Olivia Rivera Memorial Fund. This meant that any potential transfer of title, any sale, or any attempt to leverage the equity for a commercial loan required the unanimous, written approval of the entire charitable board of directors. By signing that single document 2 weeks ago, I had effectively frozen the asset entirely. I had intentionally stripped myself of the unilateral power to sell the house on a sudden whim. This crucial, hidden fact made Grant's elaborate conspiracy exponentially more pathetic. He was not simply attempting to steal a multi-million-dollar asset that did not belong to him. He had spent months carefully forging my signature, fabricating false medical records, and bribing a corrupt notary to steal a property that was entirely, legally paralyzed. He was preparing to stand in front of a syndicate of wealthy private equity lenders and offer them a phantom asset, completely unaware that the title he was trying to leverage was securely locked inside a philanthropic vault. For the very first time since the heavy steel door of the cellar had slammed shut, a genuine, completely unforced smile spread across my face. Grant had always prided himself on being the ultimate, untouchable provider. He built his entire fragile masculine identity on the illusion that he was a powerful, commanding corporate figure who controlled our wealth, our reputation, and our future. He truly thought locking his wife in the dark basement was the ultimate assertion of his dominance. I finally understood that when I unlocked the hidden staircase and stepped out of the shadows, I would not merely be stopping a fraudulent real estate transaction, I would be completely obliterating the pathetic, artificial foundation of the man he pretended to be. I was going to tear down his entire constructed reality, document by undeniable document, right in front of the exact audience he had so desperately gathered to impress. I shifted my gaze to the secondary perimeter monitor. A sleek black luxury town car was slowly turning onto the long, winding gravel driveway leading up to the main house. The bright, piercing headlights cut through the thick Virginia night, sweeping across the ancient oak trees. The lenders had arrived, the audience was taking their seats, and the final act was ready to begin. The heavy oak doors of the tasting room swung open. The suffocating heat of the room rushed out to meet the new arrivals. But Grant was already moving, his desperation masking the rising temperature. 2 boutique private equity investors and a senior representative from a private credit fund stepped across the threshold. They wore tailored wool suits and carried thin leather briefcases, expecting the refined elegance of a high-end property acquisition. Instead, they walked into a room vibrating with barely contained panic. Grant immediately deployed his most charming, practiced smile, motioning for them to take their seats around the massive oak table. "Gentlemen, welcome to Asheville," Grant announced, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of the frantic edge it held just moments ago. "I must apologize for the warmth in here. We are doing a minor reset on the climate matrix. My wife, unfortunately, cannot join us this evening. She has been working consecutive 80-hour weeks on her restoration projects and is resting upstairs. She is completely exhausted, but all the transfer procedures have been pre-approved and signed with her full consent." Sloane Mercer seamlessly slipped back into her role as the brilliant, detached consultant. She stepped forward, her posture rigid, and began distributing the fraudulent portfolios to the newly arrived guests. Her tone was sharp and clinical, utilizing dense legal terminology to weave an illusion of absolute legitimacy. She spoke of expedited equity transfers, durable medical power of attorney clauses, and seamless asset reallocation, effectively blinding the investors with a flurry of sophisticated jargon. Cormac Vale remained seated in the corner, despite knowing the property was locked under a strict conservation easement. The billionaire developer stayed quiet. His predatory instincts kept him anchored to his leather chair. He wanted to watch this train wreck unfold, calculating if there was still some fractional percentage of profit he could extract from Grant's impending doom before completely abandoning the ship. Across the table, Travis Boone was completely falling apart. When Sloane instructed him to prepare the official seal, his hands shook so violently that the heavy brass notary stamp rattled loudly against the polished wood. He kept darting his pale, terrified eyes toward the exit, looking exactly like a man who knew he was standing on the wrong side of a federal indictment. Down in the vault, my fingers hovered over the master control keyboard. The investors had opened their portfolios. They were looking at my forged signature. The curtain was up. It was time to burn down the stage. I engaged the master override for the tasting room's multimedia system. Grant had a glossy, highly produced real estate promotional video queued up on the twin massive screens disguised as vintage mirrors. I completely purged his presentation from the local network. Upstairs, the screens abruptly went black. A loud, sharp burst of static echoed through the ceiling speakers. The investors looked up, confused. Then, the digital execution began. The screens flared back to life, but they were no longer showing rolling vineyards and drone footage of the estate. Instead, the displays broadcasted a sequence of high-definition, time-stamped security images and video clips. The first image was a stark, black-and-white frame of the heavy cellar door, clearly showing the exterior deadbolts engaged. A bright red digital timestamp in the corner read 9:00 p.m. The next frame showed Sloane and Travis spreading the forged medical declarations across the tasting table. Then, the video feed switched to a live replay of Grant from just 20 minutes earlier. The audio was crystal clear, blasting his own frantic confession into the room. "I owe millions," Grant's recorded voice shrieked from the speakers, his face distorted with panic on the massive screens. "The creditors are circling me like vultures. This house is the only clean asset left. It is a gold mine. It is the only thing that can save me before they crush me completely." The entire tasting room plunged into absolute, dead silence. The two boutique investors slowly lowered their portfolios, staring at the screens in pure shock. The credit fund representative turned his head, his eyes shifting from the damning video to Grant's completely bloodless face. They instantly realized they were not sitting in a sophisticated luxury closing. They were sitting in the middle of a massive, poorly executed heist, and the true owner of the property was clearly watching them do it. "Turn that off," Grant screamed, his charming facade violently shattering into a million pieces. He lunged across the room, frantically pressing buttons on the wall-mounted control panel, desperately trying to sever the power to the monitors. But right as his hand slammed against the useless plastic switches, a deep, heavy mechanical thud echoed from the library wall directly adjacent to the tasting room. The heavy grinding of steel gears turning against stone filled the suffocating silence. It was the sound of a verdict being delivered. The massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf built into the library wall slowly swung outward, revealing the hidden passage. The heavy dust settled as I stepped out from the shadows and walked directly into the blinding light of the tasting room. I was not the broken, hysterical woman Grant had described. I wore a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit. My hair was neatly pulled back. My posture was entirely straight. And my face was as calm and unforgiving as the stone foundations of the house. I walked toward the center of the room, the sharp click of my heels commanding the absolute attention of every single man present. I reached the heavy oak table and dropped two thick, meticulously organized folders right on top of Sloane's fabricated legal garbage. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, my voice cutting through the stifling heat like a blade. "I apologize for the theatrical interruption. As you can clearly see, I am not resting upstairs. For the past hour, my husband and his mistress locked me inside the subterranean wine cellar in a desperate attempt to force a fraudulent transfer of this estate." I gestured toward the frozen, terrified group. "Let me clarify exactly who you are doing business with tonight. Grant Holloway is a desperate mastermind drowning in catastrophic corporate debt. Sloane Mercer is the architect of a fabricated psychological profile designed to strip me of my legal rights. Travis Boone is a corrupt notary hired to illegally authenticate forged documents. And Cormac Vale is a developer who knows perfectly well this property has zero commercial viability, but sat here anyway to see if he could pick the bones clean." Grant took a shaky step forward, raising his hands in a pathetic, defensive gesture. "Do not listen to her," he stammered, his voice cracking violently. "She is having a severe episode. She is losing her mind. She does not know what she is saying." I did not even look at him. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small digital tablet, and dropped it onto the table next to the folders. With a single tap, the screen illuminated, displaying the immutable digital lock logs from the cellar door, the complete audio transcript separated by minute markers, and the raw metadata files of the security footage. "These are the permanent server logs," I stated coldly. "They prove exactly when Grant engaged the deadbolts and trapped me against my will. The evidence of my forced confinement is already in the possession of the county authorities." I placed my hand firmly over the 2 folders I had brought from the vault. "Furthermore, this property does not fall under marital assets. I purchased and restored this estate through a highly restrictive prenuptial trust. Grant does not own a single stone in this building. Even if he did, he could not sell it tonight." I opened the first folder, revealing the freshly signed legal addendum. "2 weeks ago, I executed an irrevocable protective covenant on this estate. The sole successor beneficiary is a registered philanthropic conservation fund. Any transfer of title requires the unanimous public vote of a 12-person charity board. This house is legally untouchable." Cormac Vale stood up violently, the legs of his heavy chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He glared at Grant with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "You are an absolute idiot, Grant." Cormac spat, buttoning his tailored jacket. "I am not putting a single dollar into a criminal circus. I am done." The 2 boutique investors did not even bother to speak. They simultaneously grabbed their briefcases, pulled out their cellular phones, and began dialing their respective legal departments as they hurried toward the door. Grant stumbled backward, his back hitting the stone wall of the fireplace. His face was entirely white, completely drained of the arrogant entitlement that had fueled him for years. As he stared at the legal documents on the table, the crushing, inescapable reality finally hit him. The house he had plotted for months to steal was never his to touch. He had destroyed his life, his freedom, and his reputation for a phantom prize. Right at that exact second, the heavy silence of the Virginia night was shattered by the piercing wail of police sirens. Red and blue emergency lights violently swept across the massive glass windows of the tasting room, illuminating the sheer terror on Grant's face. The heavy mahogany doors of the tasting room did not simply open this time, they were thrust violently inward. The oppressive, sweltering heat of the room was instantly met with the cold, unforgiving reality of the law. Mara Quill stepped across the threshold, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the chaotic scene. She looked like an executioner in a tailored wool coat. Flanking her were 2 uniformed county sheriff deputies, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts, and a senior investigator from the Regional Title Fraud Division. The red and blue emergency lights from the cruisers parked on the front lawn pulsed aggressively through the massive glass windows, casting long, erratic shadows across the oak tasting table. "Nobody moves a single muscle," the lead deputy commanded, his voice booming with absolute authority, instantly freezing every person in the room. Mara walked directly toward the center of the room, completely ignoring the stunned private equity investors who were currently huddled near the fireplace. She unclasped her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legally binding documents, slapping them down right next to Sloan Mercer's fabricated portfolio. I am serving an emergency ex parte injunction freezing all transfers, sales, or encumbrances on this specific property, Mara announced, her voice echoing off the stone walls. I am also serving an immediate emergency protection order on behalf of my client, Brooklyn Rivera. Furthermore, the district attorney has authorized a comprehensive search and seizure warrant for all electronic devices, physical ledgers, and digital signature tokens currently present in this room. The sheer weight of the legal pressure was the final blow to an already fractured conspiracy. Travis Boone completely broke. The corrupt notary collapsed to his knees right there on the hardwood floor, his cheap briefcase spilling its contents everywhere. He threw his hands up into the air, tears of absolute panic streaming down his pale, sweating face. "I did not finish the notarization," Travis shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my husband. "I swear to you, the brass seal never touched the paper. Grant and Sloan promised to wire $25,000 to my offshore account to authenticate the medical declarations. They told me she was legally incapacitated. I was just a hired contractor. I had absolutely no idea they locked her in the basement." Sloan Mercer's sophisticated, icy demeanor shattered entirely, seeing the undeniable reality of prison time staring her in the face. She instantly attempted to sever herself from the man she had been sleeping with for months. She took a massive step away from Grant, raising her chin in a desperate display of defiance. "I was merely retained for corporate document preparation," Sloan declared, lying through her teeth right to the sheriff. "Grant Holloway is completely unhinged. He provided the medical files. He provided the forged signatures. I was simply following the explicit directions of a manipulative, abusive client who orchestrated this entire fraudulent scheme." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached across the table, tapped the screen of my tablet, and pulled up the encrypted communication logs I had extracted from the local network. "That is a fascinating defense, Sloan," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sympathy, "especially considering the side deal you established directly with Cormac Vale. At 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, you sent Cormac a secure text message outlining your exact strategy to forcefully evict Grant from the holding company the second the deed was officially transferred. You explicitly detailed how you plan to take a 40% cut of the equity and leave Grant holding the entirety of the corporate debt. You were never just a consultant. You were the architect of his absolute ruin." Grant's head snapped toward Sloan, his eyes wide with a horrified, agonizing realization. He had burned his marriage, destroyed his reputation, and committed multiple federal felonies for a woman who had meticulously planned to throw him to the wolves the very next day. The betrayal, combined with the catastrophic collapse of his entire life, pushed Grant over the edge of sanity. He let out a raw, guttural scream of absolute despair. He lunged across the heavy oak table, his hands violently reaching toward me, as if he could somehow physically rip the evidence from my grasp or throttle the truth out of my throat. He never even made it past the edge of the wood. The lead sheriff deputy moved with lightning speed, tackling Grant around his waist. The sheer momentum carried them both hard to the floor, shattering the remaining wine glasses and sending sharp crystal flying across the room. Grant thrashed wildly, screaming my name, begging me to stop the madness, but the deputy swiftly pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping around Grant's wrists echoed loudly over his pathetic sobbing. It happened right in front of the elite, wealthy investors he had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to impress. They watched him writhe on the floor like a common thief, his expensive silk suit ruined, his dignity completely eradicated. The title fraud investigator wasted no time. He immediately began bagging Grant's open laptop, the sophisticated digital signature tokens they had used to forge my foundation approvals, and the thick, physical folders containing the fabricated telehealth records. The investigator also secured the preliminary banking ledgers I had printed, which clearly documented every single dollar Grant had systematically embezzled from Asheville Conservation Advisory and the Lucia Rivera Memorial Fund. "Grant Holloway and Sloan Mercer, you are both under arrest," the deputy announced, hauling a weeping, broken Grant up to his feet. Sloan stood completely rigid, her face a mask of silent terror as a second deputy tightly secured her wrists in cold steel. "You are being charged with extortion, coercion to seize property, felony false imprisonment, wire fraud, and severe document forgery. You have the right to remain silent." Cormac Vale and Travis Boone were immediately separated by the remaining officers, detained for aggressive questioning regarding their direct involvement in the criminal conspiracy and the civil damages they had actively facilitated. As the deputies marched Grant and Sloan out of the grand tasting room, out of the magnificent stone mansion they had tried to steal, and directly into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting patrol cars, I stood perfectly still. I did not shed a single tear. I just watched them disappear into the dark Virginia night. The aftermath of that single evening stretched over the next 6 months. It was a surgical, merciless dismantling of Grant's entire existence. I filed for an immediate, aggressive divorce, working relentlessly alongside Mara Quill. I secured sweeping judicial orders that completely froze every single financial account, holding company, and credit line Grant had ever touched. We launched a massive civil litigation suit against Cormac Vale's development firm for conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, forcing a quiet but incredibly lucrative settlement that heavily penalized his predatory practices. Furthermore, I released a fully transparent, independent internal audit of Asheville Conservation Advisory to the public and my investors, meticulously clearing my company's name and proving that the embezzled funds were entirely the result of isolated, criminal spousal theft. 9 months later, the subterranean vault where I was once trapped looked completely different. I had authorized a total architectural redesign of the lower levels. The cold, damp wine cellar was completely gutted and transformed. It was now a breathtaking, climate-controlled heritage archive and a private tasting library entirely dedicated to the Lucia Rivera Memorial Fund. The heavy steel door that Grant had locked to bury me was replaced with magnificent, reinforced glass panels that showcased the history of the estate. The space that was meant to be my quiet tomb was now a brightly lit, beautiful sanctuary that honored my mother's legacy and funded the preservation of countless historical sites. It is a crisp Friday evening in late November. I am standing in the center of the grand parlor upstairs, hosting a private fundraising gala for the charity board. The room is filled with genuine philanthropists, brilliant architects, and dedicated conservationists. There are no frantic lies, no suffocating heat, and no desperate men trying to sell illusions. I hold a delicate crystal glass of sparkling water, looking out at the incredibly successful, peaceful ecosystem I have protected. I am calm, I am not bitter, and I am not angry. I stand before my guests with the quiet, cold authority of a woman who knows exactly what she is worth. Grant and Sloan truly believed that locking me in the dark was the perfect way to steal my home and my life. But the only thing they actually accomplished was locking themselves permanently inside a brilliant, inescapable trap that their own blind greed had built for them. They handed me the hammer, and I simply let them build their own coffins. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support it further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.